Toronto soars, Vancouver prices are being dragged down by the plunge in sales. That brings us to our chart of the week. While the benchmark price of a Vancouver detached home was down 6.6% in January, the average sale price tells an even starker story. Average price of a single-family home hit a high watermark of $1.82 million last year, and now at $1.5 million in January, and that's a plunge of 17.5%. Let's get more now on the state of the Vancouver housing market. I spoke earlier with Steve Saretsky, retailer at Sutton West Coast. He's also the blogger behind Van City Condo Guide. I asked him if the recent sales data out of Vancouver was the start of a bigger trend.
I think one of the best ways to look at it is actually to look at sales comparables, something that was maybe selling last year to, what things are selling for now. If you look at it for most areas, it's down about 15 to 20% on the detached market. Obviously some of the higher end stuff, on the west side of Vancouver, that's about 20%. I think just to add to that, definitely the way the market is right now, it's a full-on buyer's market in these areas, and there's definitely a lot of downwards pressures on prices. It looks like it's the correction is going to continue into the spring.
Now, the big argument there, and I know from following a lot who follow Vancouver real estate, everyone's trying to point their finger at exactly what led to the undoing of the market. Did it simply collapse in on itself? Was it the foreign buyer tax? From your point of view on the ground there, what pushed Vancouver over the edge into this rapid cool down?
Yeah, definitely, there was obviously a slowdown before the foreign buyers tax. I definitely think that the foreign buyer tax obviously escalated that price correction. I think it changed a lot of the psychology for local buyers as well, just kind of expecting that automatically that would bring prices down. So there almost came a bit of a friction point, a bit of a standoff in terms of what the buyers then were willing to pay the sellers. And I think right now sellers are still kind of adjusting to that correcting market.
Now, we've only had it in place for a couple months since last August. Now we already have Premier Clark coming out and saying, well, wait a minute, let's modify it now. If you've got a work permit, you can buy some real estate. What's the motivation there? Was the plan here, the clampdown, just a little too effective?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a concern. Obviously, if you look at it, we're going into an election here in May, and obviously with the market sort of coming apart right now, there's every incentive to try to keep things together going into the election. Obviously, she doesn't want to be blamed for crashing the real estate market here. So I think that's maybe one of the ways to look at it and trying to appease everybody. I know that I've had clients personally that are from the States that are here working, and obviously this 15% foreign buyers tax affects them as well. So I think it's the right thing to do, but it's definitely interesting timing and probably could have been planned out better for sure.
One of the interesting things, too, when I look at the Vancouver market, where people will make the argument that, okay, we can make as many policy moves as we want in Canada, but you have to watch in terms of currency outflows from China and the value of the Canadian dollar. Last year at this time when the Vancouver market was roaring, the Canadian dollar was in some pretty deep doldrums. Is there credence to that argument that it's more about currency outflows from China?
I think that's a huge thing. Definitely if you look at it, right, there's been a huge chokehold on that. Obviously they're now restricting up, 50,000. You have to basically sign a grant or whatever you want to call it, that they won't use that money to purchase international real estate. And so I think if you look at it, globally, a lot of these luxury markets globally are now slowing down. So Vancouver is not by itself.
Now, last week, the Toronto Real Estate Board came out with its forecast for the Toronto market, and it talked about the foreign buyers. They said it's only about 5% of the purchases when they polled their realtors, and that any kind of tax would just sort of destabilize the market and is unnecessary. Considering what you've been through in Vancouver and the cool down you've seen now, what observations do you have about the Toronto market, and do we look a lot like Vancouver if we turn back the clock a year or two?
I definitely think that, anytime you have these astronomical price gains, I think it's fueled by a lot of the same symptoms. And I definitely think that, we had the same arguments here in Vancouver that, I know for a fact, the BC Real Estate Association came out and a lot of the realtors were saying that, it's only about 5%. And then, of course, I think if you really, if you poll the realtors individually, if you get them aside and you ask them, what the numbers are, it's definitely more than 5% in Vancouver. Obviously I can't speak for Toronto, but I think, ultimately you're asking a profession that, has every incentive to, to keep the ball rolling. it might not be the best poll. So I definitely think Toronto could be following in a lot of the same footsteps as Vancouver.
Now, there's a phenomenon in Toronto, I know it holds true for Vancouver as well. As prices become unaffordable in the urban core, everyone pushes out and you see big price gains. But Vancouver has an interesting wrinkle that as people are getting pushed out, and then there's a 15% tax on the foreign buyer in the city itself, we see a lot of activity outside. Any sense that that investment money is saying, okay, I can't play in Vancouver, let's just move outside of the city?
There seems to be like a bit of a general consensus, at least among the public, that some of this money is pushed out. I mean, I have a lot of people reaching out to me asking me what's going on in Victoria. A lot of locals over there are concerned that the market is being affected by foreign capital because there's no tax there. I think that's certainly a possibility. It's hard to pinpoint it, and it's kind of like I said. I mean, I think that the 15% foreign buyers tax in Vancouver is maybe not so much the foreign buyer being totally eliminated as to changing the psychology amongst local buyers here. So I think that plays a huge part of it as well.
Well, thanks for your time today.
Hey, my pleasure, Greg.
That was Steve Saretsky, realtor at Sutton West Coast. He's also the blogger behind Van City Condo Guide.